Once again, people filled the earth, and among them there was a good man called Abraham. God chose him for a special plan. He promised Abraham he would make a great nation for Abraham's family. Then God gave a son to Abraham and his wife Sarah. They named him Isaac. One day God called to Abraham, "Abraham, take Isaac, your only son whom you love so much. Go into the wilderness and sacrifice him to me." Usually Abraham would kill a lamb and offer it to God. Must he kill his son this time? The thought of this made Abraham very sad, but he knew he must obey God. The next morning, Abraham loaded his donkey and set out with Isaac. Isaac did not understand what was happening. "Where is the lamb that we are going to sacrifice?" he asked his father. Abraham replied, "God will give us one." Then Abraham built an altar. He put Isaac on top of the altar. Slowly he took out his knife. Just then a voice from heaven called out, "Stop! Don't hurt the boy. I now know you love me because you obeyed my voice." Just then Abraham saw a ram caught in the nearby bushes. Instead of his son, Abraham sacrificed the ram and offered it to God. God was pleased. All right, that's the end. Are you guys ready for questions?
Yep.
Who is the main character? Annika.
Abraham.
Good job. Who was Abraham's wife and son? Jalen.
His wife was Sarah and his son was Isaac.
Good job. Who told Abraham to sacrifice his only son? Landon.
God.
Good job. What did Isaac ride on the way up to the mountains? Isaac?
A donkey.
Very good. When Isaac asked where was the lamb that they were going to sacrifice, what did Abraham say? Jalen.
God will give us one.
Very good. What did the voice from heaven call out? Isaac?
Stop.
Very good.
Stop.
And what animal did Abraham end up sacrificing? Annika.
Ram.
Very good.
I was gonna say.
All right, you guys did great. Give yourself a round of applause. Yay!
This is the CBS Evening News.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chelsea McCormick. Thank you for tuning in to the 9 o'clock news tonight, where CBS brings you the latest and greatest. Speaking of latest and greatest, there's been rumors about Abraham. We are here to clear this whole mess up for you. It seems as though people have recently seen Abraham taking his son Isaac to the mountains. However, nobody knows why. So we have Audrey on the scene with a friend of Abraham. Audrey?
Yes, I'm here with a dear friend of Abraham, Sam Gross. Hello, Sam.
Hello.
So how do you know Abraham?
Abraham and I have lived by each other for a while now, and we started to develop a friendship.
Many people are asking where Abraham was taking his son. We know Abraham took him to the mountains. However, do you know why?
Abraham heard a calling from God. God told Abraham to take his only son Isaac, who he loved so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains.
So God wanted Abraham to sacrifice his one and only son?
Yes, it sounds so crazy, but it is true.
Well, there you have it. The reason Abraham was taking Isaac to the mountains was to sacrifice him to God. Thanks, everyone. This was Audrey Bowman reporting live from CBS Evening News.
Thanks, Audrey. As you can see, the story of Abraham may not make sense. You may be having a lot of questions as to why God would do this. We have Morgan on the scene with Dr. Levinson. Morgan?
Good evening, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Levinson. Dr. Levinson has known Abraham for a while, so he will try and answer questions about Abraham at his best. Dr. Levinson, a question that everyone would like to know is, how will Abraham not be portrayed to everyone?
His destiny as father, and indeed the originating promise of the whole narrative about him, are intrinsically tied to the prophetic role he and the promised nation are to exercise, a role centered on doing what is just and right.
What would you say are the main differences in the story of Abraham and in the three religions that believe in Abraham: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam?
On one hand, all of them revere the man and find him a model for their own communities, each in his own way. On the other hand, the central action of God in each set of scriptures lies in a much later period. In Judaism, it lies with God's gift of the Torah on Mount Sinai in the time of Moses. In Christianity, the central event of all human history lies with Jesus, with his teaching to some degree, but even more with his redemptive death and his subsequent resurrection and ascension to his divine Father. In Islam, it ties with God's dictation of the Quran, his highest and final revelation, and the fullest, truest guide for human beings to Muhammad through the medium of the angel Gabriel.
Thank you, Dr. Levinson. I hope this clears up some questions for all of you. This was Morgan Scow reporting live for CBS Evening News.
Thanks, Morgan. Hopefully this mischievous story of Abraham is starting to come together for all of you wondering. However, there are a few more questions that we would like to answer for all of you. We have Caitlin Sikora on the scene with a psychologist that may know the answers. Caitlin?
Hello, everyone. I am here with psychologist Dr. Jones. He is here to answer a few more questions you all may have. If Abraham had wanted to prove his devotion and obedience, why didn't he offer to sacrifice himself?
If Abraham had sacrificed himself, it wouldn't have been his ultimate sacrifice, for he was to sacrifice the thing that he loved most.
Why is Sarah excluded from this important communication with God?
The assumptions of the biblical writers had about paternity rights allowed them to portray the story this way, to ignore Sarah throughout the entire process of sacrificing their son.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for sitting down with us today. I'm Caitlin Sikora, and thank you for joining us tonight on CBS Evening News.
Thanks, Caitlin. As you can see, CBS Evening News has tried to clear the whole story of Abraham up for you. We hope we have answered many of your questions. Chelsea McCormick for CBS Evening News.
Role in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Do you guys know anything about that?
Audrey?
Judaism likes to recognize Abraham as someone who looked to God as the only God. In the beginning of the story, it talks about his family making idols, suggesting polytheism, but Abraham shows his devotion to God, solidifying the idea of polytheism. He also became the patriarch of the Jewish nation, and Christianity teaches something very similar.
What about Abraham in Islam?
Sam?
In Islam, Abraham is seen as one of many of the greatest prophets. The Quran includes the story of Abraham as a child, and he tells his father that worshiping idols is wrong. As punishment, his dad throws him into a furnace, but miraculously he survives because of his faith in Allah. Islam also talks about how God chooses his people on commitment rather than lineage, meaning that Abraham's only true followers are true believers, Muslims. We know the Quran does not specify which son God tells Abraham to sacrifice. What can you guys say about that?
Caitlin?
Some interpreters conclude that the prophet was descended from Hagar, the slave woman's son Ishmael. Later, after some more thought, the scholarly opinion determined that Ishmael was the son to be sacrificed. This is in great contrast with what the religions say, which is that Isaac was the one that almost was sacrificed.
Do you all think Abraham could be the way to potentially unite these three religions?
Morgan?
It's hard to say. He has a great connection to each of these religions, but since each one is working from a different text, it doesn't make sense for them to all agree with each other.
How do you think God intended to use Abraham as a teaching in the Bible?
Audrey?
His destiny as father and indeed the originating promise of the whole narrative about him are intrinsically tied to the prophetic role he and the promised nation are to exercise, a role centered on doing what is just and right.
What is the role of Abraham in the Jewish religion?
Sam?
As the story in the Hebrew Bible would have it, the Jewish people descends, in fact, from Abraham through his son Isaac. It is thus not surprising that the patriarch has long been known in the Jewish traditions as our father Abraham.
What does Paul write about Abraham? Caitlin?
As early as the New Testament itself, we find the Apostle Paul writing that those who believe are the descendants of Abraham.
How does the Islam belief of Abraham compare to Jews and Christians? Morgan?
The Jews and Christians hold the book of Genesis in common. Neither that book nor any other biblical text are scripture for Muslims. And though the Muslim scripture, the Quran, has dozens of references to Abraham, many of the biblical texts about the figure in Genesis are missing. There are many Quran texts about him that appear to have no parallel in Genesis.
Hey, I heard you were a noble one. Ooh, if you believe in God, you'll sacrifice your son. Show God that you do. Take him to the land of Moriah. Ooh, hey, I heard you were a noble one. Ooh. If God is your Holy One, then sacrifice your only son. He packed his servants and boy to the mountain they did deploy. The arrival was good, they grabbed the wood. Isaac went to the altar, not knowing his life would halt there. God lights them on the mountain, burned to bits. His son's life is about to quit. The angel said, wait, you showed your faith. Don't touch your son, he's not the one. The ram instead, sacrificed till dead. Hey, I heard you were a noble one. Ooh, if you believe in God, you sacrifice your son. You've showed God that you do. He will now bless your family and you. Ooh, hey, I heard you were a noble one. Take it strong, you've done no wrong to sacrifice your only son. That was the big one. Now you will be blessed, a life without mess. And to you kin, let there be many of them. Let their opponents be beat with little defeat, and the enemy's cities will be blessed under your subsidiaries. And as you believe, you bless your family to achieve. Hey, I heard you were a noble one. Ooh, if you believe in God, you'll sacrifice your son. Don't show that you do. He will now bless your family and you. Ooh, hey, I heard you. You were a faithful one, blessed are you and your king. You saddled up and were rewarded with a win. You were a noble one, that is a matter of fact. You showed God that on his call you would act. In love for your Lord you did not lack. Go on in life, knowing that heaven will accept you. Hey, I heard you were a noble one. Ooh, if you believe in God, you sacrifice your son. You showed God that you do. He will now bless your family and you. Ooh, hey, I heard you were a noble one. Ooh, you were a faithful one, blessed are you and your kin. You saddled up and were rewarded with a win. You were a noble one, this a matter of fact. You showed God that on his call you would act.
If I was your boyfriend, I'd never let you go. I could take you places you ain't never been before. Baby, take a chance so you'll never ever know. I got money in my hands that I really like to blow. Swipe, swipe.